Hello, everyone, and welcome to the User Research Strategist podcast. I am your host, Nikki Anderson, and I have a wonderful guest on here today, Steve Jenks. Welcome, Steve. How are you?
I'm living the dream. Thanks, Nikki. Thanks for having me.
We're still living the dream. I love that. So, we are going to talk about something fascinating today, which is performing research, reporting to stakeholders in products that you're not directly involved in and maybe can't directly influence all the way. But before we dive into that, Steve, do you mind just giving the audience a quick introduction on yourself?
Sure. I am a user experience researcher out of Denver, Colorado, at a company called MeasuringU. We're a full service research agency and software. We have our own software that we use for doing surveys, but also moderated solutions, things like that. I'm also a research faculty member at the University of Denver, where I teach research methods and statistics. So, kind of working towards that democratization of research and making sure people kind of understand the basics and the importance of research. I have a PhD in higher education policy with a focus in research methods and statistics. So I used to work both in education policy and education technology for over a decade in some versions of student affairs. So working on college campuses before I transitioned into more direct UX work. I love the challenge of helping organizations to make data-informed decisions, whether that be in the academic space or through different versions of product. And so this really has been a great transition for me in using my skills in a new and exciting way that I actually see out in the real world.
It's always super interesting to me. Like, I worked a bit in academia and academic research, and I was in there for such a short amount of time that I didn't see a lot of like real world application to the things that I was doing. So when I went into user research, I was like, things are changing. Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, one of the things about my story and my journey into UX is that I became more involved in UX, but also especially in the education technology space, doing research on how to improve their systems and improve that experience for students while I was going through my PhD. So I never had the opportunity to just be an academic and only be a faculty member. I've always taught as an adjunct in addition to my full-time role. So it's a little different of a journey than I think some people have experienced as they move away from academia. I kind of did them in tandem, and here I am.
That's really cool. I'm also a huge fan of Measuring You. I feel like I send so many Measuring You links out. I'm like, check out this post and this post and this post.
Absolutely. Yeah, we try to do a lot of improving of the field as well as working with our clients.
Yeah, which is super awesome. And actually getting to that client work agency, that's actually it's the one place that I haven't worked as a researcher. I've done like consultancy freelance, I've in-house stuff, but agency, can you demystify the agency setting as a user researcher as much as you can?
Sure. The demystification, let's see. One of the unfortunate things about the field, I think, is that we're seeing a lot of companies prioritize other areas of their business that are not research and particularly UX research. And so sometimes those areas are either understaffed or underfunded, and they're unable to do the research that they should be doing in order to improve their products. Where agencies are helpful is that we can fill that role. So where there is budget or where there is the extra manpower that maybe a team doesn't have or the time that a team doesn't have right now to work on something, they can go to an agency and get that support. At our agency, that can involve full service research, which is really where I'm involved. So that goes from scoping out your project all the way to collecting the data, analyzing it, presenting it to your stakeholders. But we can also do just participant recruitment for you, or we have our platform that people need sometimes to help them do their research, or we also have a lot of learning opportunities and workshops that we can do. So agencies really fill roles that maybe are starting to fade a little bit in some spaces. Hopefully they'll start to come back. But even if a company has a full team of researchers and people that are working on this type of thing full time, sometimes you have a time crunch, or sometimes you just don't know how to get the right participant. And so an agency might be more skilled in that area to be able to help supplement that research and make it a more positive experience.
Absolutely. I know so many researchers, particularly like solo researchers who rely a lot on like help from agencies when they're time crunch, resource crunch, whatever crunch it might be. It's very crunchy over there as a solo user researcher. So absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. So in terms of, I know a lot of people like, especially who maybe do consultancy or are interested in doing agency work, are might get a little bit concerned about what it's like to work with people who are kind of like on the outside, or maybe you're on the outside as an external vendor. So can you actually talk through your experience as being a user researcher kind of like externally from how maybe full-time in-house people might be used to it?
I think the biggest challenge or hurdle that you face, that may be obvious, is that you just don't have the hands-on or direct experience with the inner workings of whatever that product may be. It may be a physical product, it could be a website, a phone app. People who work on those things every day and that's their company, they're just going to know more about that product than you will. And sometimes, especially in our agency work, we get many, many projects every year. And sometimes they're things that I'm very familiar with, different social media platforms, or maybe a website that I shop on. And then sometimes you get things where you're like, oh, I didn't even know that was a thing. And now that I've worked on it, all of my algorithms are ruined and I get ads for them all the time. So I'm very familiar with them, but I didn't know much about that product going into that research. And so some of the challenge that can come from being on the outside is getting yourself familiar enough with that product to be able to understand the research goals, to understand the business need for this research, and ultimately figuring out how this research is going to inform that product moving forward in the most positive way. Sometimes that comes from just great active listening when meeting with your clients. That's how we refer to them. So when I'm meeting with my research partners at other companies, having them just kind of walk me through, like, what is the product? Can you show me the product? What are the current challenges of that product? Even if it may not be directly related to that research, trying to get that crash course of like, what is this? How do I get myself embedded in it? And then doing research outside of that too. Most things are not a complete secret. You can do some sort of research online. You can go to their website and poke around and see maybe where some of those challenges are. You can read reviews on Reddit or on other online spaces where you can learn about, what are people's challenges with that product. Really taking that time to learn about that product and that space before you jump right into the research, I think can help give you that foundation that's missing. And also helps you know, like, what are you still missing? What do you still not entirely understand about that? Um, and I think the other big piece is it just comes with experience. And that's as you're moving through that research process, you learn more about what are the right questions you need to ask in order to give yourself that knowledge foundation to start that research process with your client.
Yeah. And I love that. It sounds like you take a lot of time well, and not too much time, right? Because we don't want
Right.
to scare stakeholders away. But sounds like you put a lot of intention and thought into that pre-work before diving into the project, which I think is applicable to any research project because I feel like in this pace that we tend to find ourselves in, which is like, let's do this now, slash a month ago, we just kind of run into things, but it is important to build that context.
Yeah, it's important to build the context, and also as a benefit to the client, I think that there's a lot of value in having an outside thought partner who isn't completely devoted to this project, because I'll be the person who asks a question that their team will say, "Oh, we didn't think about that." Or, they'll give us a list of their preliminary questions that maybe they want to ask on a survey, and we'll note, "Hey, you asked about this, but these are your research questions. Like, is this other question important at all?" And they'll say, "Oh yeah, like we hadn't even thought about that, or we didn't consider that that could be a thing." And that's because, when you're seeing it for fresh eyes, you get the opportunity to think about things in new ways, whereas sometimes you just get in the thought process of thinking through something the same way in one way, and you can't break away from that. It's why people go to therapy to talk through their challenges, or why you meet with your friends to talk through things, because sometimes you just need that extra voice to help you realize the pieces that you might be missing, which ultimately can create a stronger research project than had that team done it without the help of an agency.
Do you want to get all of your user research questions answered all while hanging out on your couch in sweatpants? No need to join any live webinars and hope that your question gets answered. No need to Google a million different things and sift through some scattered advice that you don't really know is valid or reliable. Not anymore. I know it sounds too good to be true, but I promise it isn't, because if you become a paid Substack subscriber, you get access immediately to a community filled with user researchers that I am in every single day answering questions. Not only can you hang out on your couch, feel less alone as a user researcher, and get all of your questions answered, not only by an expert, but by a bunch of other user researchers with amazing perspectives and experience, you can do all of that on your couch in sweatpants, and I will be alongside there with you every step of the way. So join my paid Substack, get immediate access, and we can relax together solving all of your user research problems. See you there.
we can get super stuck in our ways of like, okay, I'm always going to do one-on-one interviews. Like, even if like that, it might not be the best methodology for that particular
Absolutely.
project. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about your process. Like, what does your workflow then look like day to, well, I'm sure there isn't a day-to-day workflow necessarily, but
Yeah.
to the extent that there can be, like, what does that process and workflow look like with a client?
So I would say in terms of the day to day or like how we typically run our process, it involves many people. So it's not just a singular researcher working with a client making all the magic happen. We have people who are reaching out to companies who are, offering our services. We have, of course, we're marketing, making sure that people know that we're here to help if they need our services to do that. Typically, a company does have some idea of what kind of research they want to do, or at least they know what the research questions are. They know what the problem is that they need to be solving. So they'll
Yes.
come to us and say, "Hey, we have this problem. Can we meet and talk that out?" And so we have people on our team who will meet and scope out those projects with our clients. So we talk through like, what is the problem that you're looking for? Is this more generative, or do you have something that you already want to evaluate? That's often the case where people say, hey, we have this new thing that we want to launch and we want to see how people feel about it. And we ask, great, do you have prototypes? No, we don't. Okay, well then that's more generative. So maybe we can help you like figure out what it is that you need to make for that prototype. Getting them to figure out like where they are in the research process, what is the best methodology, what is their budget and how do we work with that? What is their timeline and how do we work with that? Speed of research while still keeping excellent research, big topics all the time in our UX spaces. And we try to help our clients to find that balance of having fast but quality, rigorous research if we can. Once we get all of that narrowed down, then we're meeting typically weekly with the client. And then, of course, a lot over email and things to talk through. Let's define your research questions, make sure these are very clear. Awesome. Now let's figure out, our either our moderation guide or the survey protocol, whatever we need. How do we craft that and match that around those research questions so we make sure we're answering them accurately? Then once we get all of that together, then, we're working through actually creating those moderation guides or the surveys, getting them programmed, getting them set up. We go through the data collection, the participant recruitment. Sometimes we do it, sometimes the client does it if we need like their customers. We have
Yeah.
to work through that. The analysis process, typically we will meet with them to kind of show them the data and say, here's kind of what we're seeing. Is this aligning with what you were looking for? Are we missing anything? Like, where else can we dig in for that? What examples do you want? Then working with them to create some sort of report. And then usually we will do the presentation of some format to their stakeholders. So they'll invite all of their important people in. We'll present that data to them. That's kind of the general flow of what we do. And then you multiply that by, 6 or 7, and they're all kind of layered on top of each other. And we're doing multiple things all at the same time. So a lot of moving pieces from week to week and from project to project that are all moving. They have different types of data collection, they have different speeds of data collection that we need. So that all can really be in flux, but that's kind of sort of the process that we go through from the start to the finish on each of these projects.
Oh my gosh, there's like 97,000 things I want to dig in there. But first and foremost, what I want to hear about is I think pushback is a thing that we always encounter as researchers. So I'm wondering, do you encounter people who come to you with a preconceived notion of what they need for you to then have to maybe talk through what instead they might need, right? So having people come to you saying, we would love this survey. And you're like, wow, you're asking not survey based questions. I'm wondering, like, how do you handle that when you almost like when it's like new? Because it's like maybe if you've worked in-house with a team and you're like, hey, Paul, no, we don't need that. And he's like, yeah, you're right, because I know you're right. How do you deal with that when you don't have that rapport?
That absolutely does happen. And, there are two things, I think. One is when our clients are coming to us for these research services, part of why they come to us is because we are experts in research, whereas maybe they're experts in product management or design or just knowing their product better, but they don't have the same expertise necessarily. And so they come to us because we're experts in that area. And so one of the things that, I love about our agency in particular is that our leadership empowers us to be those experts and to say, you said your business need is this, and this is the problem that you're trying to investigate. Our recommendation is actually that you do it this way. Maybe there's a better way that we can kind of tackle that problem. And typically we find that people are pretty receptive to that. Where we have a little bit more of a challenge is if we are pressed for time or the resources aren't there, sure, it would be awesome to have 500 one-hour interviews, but like it just isn't feasible and also not necessary. So we use a lot of our experience in that way in order to kind of say, you don't need to do quite that many. You're actually going to get really good, rigorous results from a much smaller sample size, or, you've mentioned a few times that you have all of these different competitors that you're looking at. Are any of those competitors similar enough that maybe we can cut some out and you're still going to get the same kind of end results that we can talk through and help to guide you through your next steps? The other thing that you mentioned at the beginning is, MeasuringU also is an agency where we're not only performing the research on for clients, but we're doing internal things that help us to talk about new metrics that are great, or talk about, we just released one that was, like, how do you plan for the no-show rate for your moderated sessions? Like, how many people are probably not going to show up when you have to do something in person? We try to provide a lot of that information too, that is done relatively accessibly to people through our blogs and through our LinkedIn posts. But it helps us too to say, hey, you mentioned that you wanted to do a survey with 50,000 people. Here's this blog post where we actually looked into this and we would be fine with more like 500. Like, how does that feel for you? And then also, I think one of the things that often gets, it's not that it gets missed, but it's like a little trickier to talk about, is the financial piece of things. People may have really grand ideas for their projects. You can often achieve something similar for a much smaller price. So if you only have a certain amount of money, we may help them to say, hey, well, based on that, kind of here's how we can scale this down. Here's how we can still be rigorous in that. And then really, one of the things that happens during the scoping process and during those initial meetings with clients is figuring out, what is that end goal? Like, what are you hoping to learn from this? And who is this going to be presented to? Are you eventually going to invite the engineers? Are you inviting marketing? Is your VP going to be here? And knowing what that end goal is also helps us to shape, oh, okay, well, they're going to want to know about this thing. So let's make sure that we add that in. Or, are we going to have enough information to inform this other team that you need to work with? So really, that's where that pushback, like if they're pushing back on something, or they come with a preconceived notion of what they want, and we don't think that's in their best interest, we'll try to help them figure out what the best thing is for their business need. It would be easy, I think, to say like, wow, you want to do a 50,000 person survey? Great. That's a really expensive project. We would love to have that, but it's not always like in the best interest of the client. So we do try to help them kind of figure out what is going to be best for them, even if it means like that project is going to cost a little less for us and we'll make a little less money to the agency. But, it's not always about our side. It's more about helping that client get to where they need to be so that they have the information for their product, and then hopefully they enjoy that experience and they come back. We have many repeat clients that they're like, last project was awesome. Let's get on a call. Let's talk about our next project. We want to use you guys again. We think this is really great. So really helping them to figure out the best way to do that establishes ourselves as a trusted thought partner and not just a business that wants their money to help them do research.
Hey everyone, I have been taking some business courses recently and I am launching a new membership that's all about how user researchers can become more business savvy, more strategic, and more of a business partner in their organizations. One of the biggest questions that I get asked is, hey, my organization isn't really mature. It has like a low user research maturity level. Please do not let the maturity of your organization dictate your user research career. That's what I did. Because I was in a lower user research maturity, I kind of let myself stagnate and I didn't really learn new things. And with that, my skills kind of like deteriorated. I lost a lot of time that I could have used to learn really, really important skills because they weren't necessarily applicable to my organization at that time. But guess what? I got fired. And then it didn't really matter what maturity level my organization was at because I was no longer there. And I wished that I had taken the time to learn some of these skills because they would have been applicable at the next places that I went into. I know that it can be hard sometimes and frustrating when you're in a low maturity organization and you want to push things, you want to learn new things, but please, please, please don't let your current organization and their levels of maturity impact your future career, because I promise you, you will not be there forever and you will need the skills that you need to learn in the future. Promise, 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 especially with the user research industry changing and us hopefully moving into that more strategic space and operating more as business partners and innovation partners to our organizations. Also, if you want more details on my membership and how to become a little bit more business oriented as a researcher, check out the link that I have. And I hope that helps.
I love how you're able to utilize the work that you do internally and the educational content that you put out, not just for the industry and researchers, but also to inform your clients like, hey, we did actually look into this. We do like there's backed evidence of why this, like, you don't need 50,000, here's 500. And I wonder like if researchers generally, whether they're in agencies or in-house, could start to even build stuff like that of almost like case studies or like little moments and pockets of like, we tried this, remember, and it worked out okay, or we tried this and it didn't work out so good. So yeah, I love that idea of using that information to help support whatever it is that the client actually needs from your perspective.
Yeah, and I've been learning that there are companies that are starting to have better research repositories. Some of them even have research librarians where it is their job to help kind of curate all of the research that they've done. One of the benefits for us of having repeat clients over and over again is that I start to build an institutional knowledge. I have one client whenever we're meeting about something else say, hey, well, actually, a year and a half ago we did a project and we already learned a little bit about this about your customer. Is that true for your team as well? Especially for bigger companies where they may have multiple teams, like they're not all talking to each other all the time, but I become that central piece that can help to inform them. And so I become the research repository in a way where I'm able to say, hey, actually, we've already addressed that, or this is a really great question. We know this from a previous study. Is there a way that we can learn more about that? Or have you considered this knowing this thing from before? So it's kind of interesting to start building that repository within that is very specific to that client. So it's not just our awesome blog of things that people can read and learn and upskill, but also the things that we're learning about those actual clients. I mean, there are processes and products I never dreamed I would want to know about, and now I do. From supply chain management and logistics to the inner workings of social media, you get to learn a little bit about all of those things, which is really the exciting part of the diversity of agency work. But also, the more you're able to work with a client, the more you're able to be an even more valuable piece of their team externally.
Absolutely. And when you were talking through your process earlier, you had mentioned, pulling in your clients or stakeholders quite frequently into like different parts of the process. Is there anything in particular that you do to like keep them engaged and to like encourage them to show up and like be a part of that process?
Yes, I would say, it is a challenge that we face sometimes because one of the reasons why people go to an agency is that they're busy and they can't do this research
Yeah.
on their own. So we are often challenged to navigate finding those meeting times with people or getting responses when we need them to review something because we're trying to fit them on our schedule. We're trying to manage multiple clients and their schedules at the same time. So it doesn't always work out. We do a lot of asynchronous work. One thing that we do very early on, though, is we do a kickoff with our client. We say, here is what we have been contracted to do. And we do a quick rundown of here are your research questions. Here is the methodology that we've talked about. Here's the timeline that we're looking at. Here is what MeasuringU promises to give to you. Here's what we expect from you in order to help you do that. One of the tricky balances is ultimately we are a business and customers are coming to us for something. So we can't be super pushy about it, but we do try to be politely firm, like, hey, in order to launch this survey on Monday, we need you to reply, or like, we need your feedback on this thing by Thursday, or we need your formal sign off on this by this time. So we just try to, keep them engaged in that way. But then ultimately, the project is theirs and we are just helping with that. And so we really want to make sure throughout the process that we kind of remind them that their input is important because that final deliverable is going to be based on all of these other steps that build up to that. And so if they disengage at some point and they say, oh, just, figure out whatever questions you want to ask, and we try to do it on our own. And then ultimately they're like, oh, why didn't you ask this question? And I say, well, because you told us to do it and then you didn't give us any feedback.
Yeah.
That doesn't help them. And so we try to make sure that we emphasize that the process that we're going through together as a team is important for that final outcome, which generally speaking, the clients that we're working with, they need this research in order to, give some sort of legitimacy to a future project or to a big change in their thing. And this research is really important for them and their job security and making sure that they are contributing to their business model. And so we want to help them to do that. But typically we find that most clients are awesome. They get back to us quickly. Sometimes they, have thoughts that we have to kind of counsel them through and say, we don't know if that's in the best interest of the study, and here's why. But generally, people are pretty good about wanting to have that thought partner, and generally also just very appreciative that we even exist to be able to help them in this process and to provide those additional services.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And I do like what you said about, hey, like in order for us to get the survey out by Monday, like could we have your sign off? Like you're creating a clear expectation and understanding of what you need from them rather than just being like, okay, we're going to send out the survey Monday, but it sounds like there's a lot of clarity in what they actually need to do so that they can slot that in.
Yes, and especially establishing the timeline up front, we really try to say, here's when we're going to be done creating your script. Here's when we are going to be done data collection. Here's when we want to get to a first draft of the report. And then anytime that there's a bump in the road, or if they say, hey, unfortunately, like a small team retreat came up, is there any way that we can push this back? We try to be politely affirmative and say, yes, of course, we can do that. Here is an updated timeline of what this will look like if we need to push everything back at this time. And sometimes, generally clients, they say, great, yep, we totally understand. This is on us. We'll do that. Sometimes they say, you know what? Maybe that doesn't work with us anymore. Let me get back to you. And then suddenly they find, an hour or two to work on something and get it back to us so we can move forward with it. So we try to be very flexible on our side. I would say, I can't even really give it a number, but I would say very few of our projects are start and end exactly how we said in that first meeting. They're generally a little longer. Every once in a while, especially now in Q4, we have clients who said, we thought we had this much time. We actually have a shorter amount of time. Can we move that up? And then the project gets a little crunchier, as you said. But more often than not, things stretch a little longer than we planned rather than them being shorter than we planned.
Yeah, of course. So I want to try and squeeze in one more question before our final
Sure.
question. So the penultimate question, what is it like, yeah, reporting to stakeholders that you might not have even ever touched base with? Because like the clients might invite all these people and you're like, hello, strangers. I have been working on this stuff for you for a while. Like, what is that like?
I think it's really exciting. One of my, like, I don't want to say secret backgrounds. I'm not very shy about it, but I came from a theatrical background. I used to do a lot of stage performances. I worked in college admissions for a long time where I did presentations about colleges. I visited high schools, like lots of opportunities to present to groups of people. And when I made my transition into education technology many years ago, I was often doing analysis on current online courses and then having to present that data back to deans of colleges or VPs of academic affairs or even presidents, sometimes having to convince them or inform them of this is kind of the trajectory of your coursework. Here's where we recommend that we make adjustments, or we need to add courses, or these courses should be expedited in the revision process, being able to do that. So I just have a lot of practice with that. But then we also have people on our team who are not as practiced with that. And I think, one of the things that makes any skill stronger is just practice. So people have an opportunity to do that. And one of the things from the agency side that is exciting, and I think I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, but people come to us because we are experts in research. That's why they need us to help them do that. And so just remembering that as we go in, nobody knows this data better than I do. Nobody knows how it connects to the research questions better than I do. And because I've gone through the process of doing that analysis, and sometimes or often we have teams of people too. So if I'm doing a presentation, I may have a team member that's sitting at the table with me who also helped to go through that data. And that way, if a question does come up from a stakeholder, I can confidently kind of bring up additional information or a quote or an anecdote that came out of the data that we have, or my teammate can kind of chime in and say something, or we can confidently say, that actually didn't come up, but we think that's an excellent area to dig into. One of the things that, of course, from a business perspective is always great is when we've given them exactly what they wanted and it spurred new questions, and we can say, that's awesome, and we would love to partner with you to explore that. at a future time as well. So kind of giving them what they wanted, presenting that information in a confident way. And then we often will have follow up where people will reach out a couple weeks later and say, hey, actually, we had somebody ask a question about this. Do we have that data? And so we're always open to redigging into something really quickly to find them additional information if they need it. But really, just that practice of being able to present out. One of the things I think for the final question that was going to come up was just a little bit, or one of the things that I think people should take away from working in this kind of capacity where you don't have a lot of direct impact on that product or you don't know a lot about it in advance is really kind of knowing the audience that you're going to have. So if they already know that they're going to have the VP of something there or engineering is going to be there, it can help us to kind of tailor how we do our reporting and how we present that information so that it's accessible and people don't sit through a whole bunch of charts if they're not math people, or they don't sit through a whole bunch of quotes when really they wanted some hard numbers. And being able to tailor that reporting process so that it's the most effective when we get to that stage, that also helps us to feel really confident when we're presenting to those stakeholders, because then we're the experts in research, we're the ones who've collected the data, but also we have curated that data to be received in the best way possible up front.
Oh, I love that. There's so many good things in there. And I wish that we had like 15 more hours because I'd be like, I have so many questions. But since you already answered my last question, I have to ask you a separate last question now.
Okay.
What would you say like your favorite industry or type of project is to work on in an agency setting?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would say, I mean, anytime I have the opportunity to work on something education related, so whether that be an education platform or like a learning and development thing for a company, like that's always exciting just because it blends my past with my current work. And one of the awesome things that I love about working in agency life is that it can be really hectic and we are juggling a lot of projects at the same time, but we get to work on a lot of different projects. So I don't go to work every day and just work on one app or one thing every day all year. I do that for a couple of weeks and then I get something new. So, I really get an opportunity to try out a lot of different things. I think the projects that give me the most energy, though, are those where I am working with clients who maybe aren't as familiar with the research process, or they're not as skilled, like they just don't have that experience. It's not something in their toolbox. And so I get the opportunity to mentor them and to kind of coach them through that. And as an educator and a researcher, I always get a lot of pride and excitement when I know that my client is getting the product that they're paying for, but they're also learning something and they're able to walk away with this as a stronger consumer of research themselves. So, working with those people who maybe aren't as strong as research can be a much more energizing experience than, say, a team at a major corporation who has researchers who come right in and they say, this is what I want, A, B, C, D, E, please follow this. Here's the script. We already give it to you. Just go do it.
Yeah.
Like that, we can do it, and that's fun. But I really like that personal experience of kind of working through the project, helping people understand more about their own processes and helping them grow in that way, because it adds to the democratization of research, which is always like a buzzword every other month or so. But truly, I do believe that people as a society need to understand kind of really basic research processes. How do you consume that research? How can you trust research? And often when I'm working with more junior people at a company or people who just don't have experience with research, I'm able to see that growth as we work through the various weeks so that at the end they do get this final project, but I can also tell that they've learned a little something.
That speaks so much to like your background. It sounds like perfect. That must be such a nice combo for you. I love that. Cool. Well, Steve, thank you so much for your time and thank you so much for everything that you shared today. There's an amazing amount of great stuff, so many nuggets in there. So I'm sure our audience is going to take so much from that. So thank you. I really, really appreciate it.
I appreciate being here. And just like any kind of client work, I'd be happy to come back and work with you again.
Perfect. I love that. Awesome. Well, as well, thank you so much to all of the listeners today, and we'll talk soon.